despite the repeated new highs in the price of gold, nobody is talking about it.
It's deep. It's going. Yes. And it is gone.
Yes. South Garden April at 142.
Mark, you sure?
Yeah, it's time to call bullshit.
Bullshit on what?
Every fucking thing.
So how does this helicopter money work?
It is bedlam at the bank as Bryce Harper has put the Phillies on top.
Banking system in the United States is sound and resilient.
And Alvarez belts it.
To right field. It's the
Despite another bank failure, Americans should take a deep breath and not worry about their money.
They're selling, Mortimer.
Did he get it? He's done a double down.
Hi, thank you for listening to episode 1, our very first podcast of Bogus Banks, Behemoth Bubbles, and Baseball Betting. It is February the 20th, 2025, and I'm your host, Chase Goldman. Now, I am going to give you full disclosure here on episode 1, podcast number 1. Chase Goldman is a fictional name. I am self-employed. I run a landscape company in Texas, and if there were a bad accident and there were plaintiff's attorneys, I certainly wouldn't want my real name on a podcast that might indicate to a plaintiff's attorney that I have investable assets that could be stolen with a judgment. So for that reason, I'm using a fictitious name, Chase Goldman. So here's the deal. You're probably, scratching your head looking at the logo and wondering, what is this about? So what this podcast is about, it's really just about, my interests. I run my business from Puerto Rico. And for that reason, I, pay a much lower income tax, but, the summer days would just be boring as hell. So what I do is I bet on baseball, and I've got some systems that I use to make my baseball bets, and they're more like if-then statements. And so I think I've got an edge, and so I'm going to give you guys my baseball picks I'm going to try to do it every weekday, although on Wednesdays during the baseball season, that might be impossible because I have to get payroll out on FedEx before they come pick it up. So I'm hoping to give Peter Schiff a run for his money in the long run. He's got over 1 million followers on Twitter, and right now I have 0 subscribers and 0 views to any of my podcasts. But Peter Schiff is on the north side of the island up in Dorado. I'm on the south side. I'm the south sider. I'm in Palmas. So I'm hoping I can give, he's one of my favorite podcasters. So I'm hoping to give him a run for his money. So the plan is during the regular baseball season, I probably won't have any macroeconomic or banking or bubble type related, information on the podcast. It's probably going to be most days just, I'm going to be struggling to get that done just to get the podcast up. So I'll basically give you guys my baseball picks for the day. We'll recap how the previous day went and where we're at season to date. But then maybe once or twice a week, I'll be able to make some content that you will hopefully enjoy. So I think we've got less than 30 days till baseball season starts. They're going to do the Tokyo series. It's going to be Dodgers and Cubs. I'm assuming they'll have, Yoshinobu, and starting for the Dodgers as their ace pitcher since Shohei Ohtani is not able to start yet. He won't be starting, I read, until June. And then Shota Imanaga is my guess is who they'll go with for their ace pitcher with the Cubs. So that's my prediction for opening day. Well, it's not really opening day, but to start the Tokyo series, they're going to play a 2-game series over there, Cubs and Dodgers. And then we'll have our real opening day in late March. But we're still about, it's the 20th, so we've got, I'm guessing that would be 26 days till baseball season really starts officially, the regular season. But today what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over, there's a lot of talk right now in the gold bug community about revaluing gold. And so I have done a little bit of research this morning and yesterday, and I've just, first of all, I just want to let you guys know I'm not the guy who comes in and I'm the know-it-all or the expert on everything. I probably know just a little bit more than you guys, and so hopefully I'm probably going to have more questions than answers in these podcasts. But what I've been looking into is, what would happen if they revalued gold today? It's valued at $42.22 an ounce on the U.S. Treasury's balance sheet. So Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about how the banking system, what it was like. Let me just back up. So there's a lot of people that don't understand that the U.S. dollar used to be backed by gold, and nowadays it's not backed by gold anymore. So the way it worked was back in 1933, Roosevelt issued an executive order. Very few people know this. I just learned it in the last 5 years. But he issued an Executive Order 6012, I believe it was. And it was, this is really weird. So the Executive Order was signed, I believe, on April the 5th, 1933. And it required all U.S. citizens to turn in all of their gold to their local bank. And that was like, they only had till May 1st to get that done. So they only had 26 days to turn in all their gold. Now, what I have learned is that they were allowed to keep up to 5 ounces of gold coins. And then they could also have jewelry. Jewelry was exempt. And then there were also collectible coins. If you could prove it was a collector's coin, then you could keep that. But, 26 days. And the penalty was up to 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Can you imagine what $10,000? That's a ridiculous. I mean, just absolutely ridiculous. Now, first of all, I don't believe that a governor or a president can sign an executive order that affects the entire population unless there's an emergency. That's the way I understand that they're supposed to work. So turning in your gold is not an emergency. An emergency would be, oh, wow, a hurricane just came through, and there's a lot of looting going on, so we're going to issue an executive order, and basically there's a curfew for the next couple days until things settle down. That would be an example of an emergency, in my opinion. But, even that one, I would have a problem with that one. The whole thing strikes me as tyrannical. But, yeah, an executive order to turn in your gold. Hopefully most of those citizens just ignored it. I know Zhang's dad or granddad ignored it, and now she's pretty wealthy. But yeah, so the way it worked was, I've been investigating this all morning, because the statutory price of gold in between 1913, when the Federal Reserve banking system was created, and 1933, when this executive order was signed, the statutory price of gold was $20.67 per ounce of gold. So all the people turned in their gold in 1933, because they had 26 days, or it was, 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine back then is probably equal to a $250,000 fine today. Maybe $1 million fine today. I mean, it's night and day. So $10,000, don't even start to think about a $10,000 fine in today's dollars. This was a massive fine if you got caught, with more than 5 ounces of gold coins. So the way it worked was that statutory valuation on the gold was $20.67. So the local banks that were nationally chartered were required by the Federal Reserve banking system to have reserves. So in other words, if you had, let's say, $100,000 worth of demand deposits from the local community. So they had come to your bank and said, I want to start a checking account. Here's my money. Here's $1,000 as my initial deposit. So they were required to keep between 9, and these percentages changed between 1913 and 1933, but they were required to keep pretty much between 9 to 13% of those demand deposits that could be withdrawn at a moment's notice. They wouldn't get a heads up. They're just like customers walk in the door, hey, I want my money, I want my gold. So they had to keep 9 to 13% of those demand deposits on reserve. So in other words, if you got $100,000 worth of total demand deposits, checking account balances, then you better have between $9,000 and $13,000 in either U.S. dollars or gold coin. Or I guess there was also a ratio of silver they could have held as well. But as a nationally chartered bank, they also had to send a lot of those reserves to the local Federal Reserve Bank. So, for example, a bank in Utah was part of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. So they would have to ship their gold and dollars all the way to that bank in San Francisco to maintain their deposits. Now, I couldn't get a straight answer on how much of that. So if you're going to hold $9,000 to $13,000 on reserve, how much of that had to go all the way to San Francisco to the Federal Reserve Bank there? I couldn't get an answer out of that with ChatGPT this morning. So, but I did get this out of chat. So remember, a gold coin, a double eagle gold coin, which had 1 ounce of gold in it, had $20 stamped on it. It was worth $20 US. So if a customer came in the front door of the bank and said, "Hey, here's $20, I'd like to get a gold coin," they would swap that out, and it was an even swap. Nobody was none the wiser. But the statutory price of gold was $20.67. So those local banks had an incentive to ship their gold off to the Federal Reserve, because a dollar would be posted up as a dollar. It would be worth $1. But if you sent them an ounce of gold, then you'd get credit for $20. So if you sent them if you sent them 1 ounce of gold, you'd get credit on your balance sheet for having $20.67. It was worth 3.3% more if you would send that gold to the Federal Reserve Bank from that bank in Utah to that Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco. So the banks so basically what we saw was a giant drain of all the gold from the local banks to the Federal Reserve Banks from 1913 to 1933. So when the citizenry was ordered to turn over all their gold, the Federal Reserve Banks were already sitting on over probably close to about 5,500 tons of gold. So when the citizenry turned in their gold under threat of imprisonment and fines, they only had another 450, it's estimated, tons of gold. So we already had a situation where 90% of the gold wasn't even in the people's hands. It was in the bank's hands already. See how that works? The local banks had that incentive, because if they just held onto that gold coin in their vault, it was worth $20. But if they'd ship it to the Federal Reserve, they'd get credit for $20.67, which was 3.3% more. And when every penny matters to the stockholders, and they're always trying to beat last quarter's numbers, every penny matters. So that's where all the gold was. So bottom line is, the population had already been stripped of their gold before any of this shit happened anyway. And that's something that I've listened to a lot of Gold Bug podcasts, and I've never gotten that information out of it before. So then after the citizenry turned in all their gold in 1933, they signed an act of Congress, I think it was the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, and what that did was it revalued gold from $20.67 an ounce to $35. And it also forced the Federal Reserve Banks for them to turn all their gold over to the U.S. Treasury. So most of that gold wound up in Fort Knox. There's a little bit in the Denver Mint today, and then another mint, but basically those three things. And of course, it hasn't been audited by a third-party independent auditor ever. That's never happened. And, you know, the consensus seems to be that the last time it was audited by, you know, anything within the government that anybody would even trust was, you know, back in the 50s. Okay, so we don't know if there's anything in Fort Knox. We do know that, okay, so from 1934, from that act, all the way up until 1971, the U.S. citizens couldn't redeem their dollars for gold with the government. They could still, and they couldn't even buy it until 1974. So they were disallowed from owning gold for all that time. And then up until 1971, foreigners could redeem their dollars for gold at the rate of $35 to the ounce. And so that went on until I believe it was 1974. In 1974, they changed the price of gold again from $35 an ounce to $42.22 an ounce, which is where it is today. And in 1974, they also passed a new law that allowed U.S. citizens to hold gold for the first time in 40 some odd years. So that's kind of, I hope you've, you know, found that to be interesting. You know, and I skated over the 1971 thing too quickly. So it was August 15th, 1971, President Nixon interrupted an episode of Bonanza on a Sunday night to say we are temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. And so ever since then, the world has been on a goldless standard. Because remember, in 1944, the Bretton Woods, you know, that was the convention they held, and pretty much all the central banks sent all of their gold to the U.S. Treasury. And the reason they did that was so that, once again, it was worth a little bit more there than it would have been otherwise, because what they could do then is they'd accept U.S. Treasuries, which were interest-bearing. So the United States had started this Ponzi scheme where, yeah, we're going to be paying you interest on your gold, which doesn't yield any interest or profits or anything like that. But they had, so the whole thing is just, yeah, weird. And very few people know about these things. So anyway, that's what I've got for today's podcast. You guys have any questions or comments, or if I've got something wrong, leave a comment on YouTube. I'm also going to try to set up a Twitter profile for this Bogus Banks, Behemoth Bubbles, and baseball betting. And anyway, we look forward to having you back for podcast number 2. Thanks for listening.